The Rover R8 was a real high point for the Rover-Honda collaboration, which started in 1984 with the SD3. The R8 that came out in 1989 was the one that involved Rover's engineering at its peak. Rover claimed over 90% of it was all Rover, helped with an all-new K-Series engine. And it also spawned all Rover derivatives, the Tourer Estate, the Cabriolet, and this, the Coupe, introduced in 1992. Well, what are they like to drive today? Because they're often overlooked from other contemporaries like the Calibra and the Corrado. Well, we thought we'd take a drive in this very late 1998 example to find out. So, 1989 was a really big year for Rover. It introduced the Land Rover Discovery at the motor show in 1989, and the other model they introduced was the Rover R8. It was a real peak time for the Rover-Honda collaboration, because Rover will tell you that about 90% of the R8 is all Rover input. And it's certainly true, whatever the real figure is that Honda certainly let Rover have more of a say in the way that the R8 and the Concerto that Honda brought out at the same time. Rover definitely had more of an input into those two cars. That's illustrated by the fact that the front suspension is traditional McPherson strut suspension rather than double wishbones, which Honda would prefer. It's certainly got a Honda arrangement at the back. The other significant thing about the R8 when it came out in 1989 was, of course, the K-Series engine, a radical new engine that was there to replace the aging A-Series. So it was launched in the R8 with a 1.4 capacity, but of course it would later go on to power all sorts of things with the 1100 capacity in things like the Rover Metro and 100, and in bigger capacities like 1.8 for the MGF. So it was a significant engine, and Rover had a lot of say in the engineering and the design of the R8 model. It was actually launched initially with just a 214 in a variety of trim levels and a 216 GSI model, which used Honda's D-Series engine. But it was very well received, and of course the R8 came out at a perfect time really. The best selling hatch of that time was the Ford Escort, but it was really long in the tooth by the time the R8 came out, and arguably therefore the R8 was a popular sort of second choice. A little bit more upmarket as well, wearing that Rover badge and having a much nicer interior than say a Mark IV Escort. So actually it went off to quite a good sales success and to some critical acclaim. The three-door model was introduced in 1991, and then by 1992 you can really see Rover's confidence pick up by this point, and they bring out this, the Coupe. Honda didn't do anything like this, by the way. They just kept with the 5-door hatch and 4-door saloon. So the Coupe was definitely a radical newcomer for Rover. It had the entry-level car of the 216, which had the Honda D-Series engine, but it also made use of Rover's 2-litre T-Series engine in normally aspirated guise and in a turbocharged model, which at just shy of 200 brake horsepower made it the fastest and most powerful Rover production car to date. It had astonishing sort of stats, 0 to 60 of just over 6 seconds and close on to 150 mph top speed. The 5-speed gearbox that it uses here is actually a Peugeot-derived gearbox, but it's no worse for that. It was quite clear that Rover had spent all their development dollars on the engine, so they didn't have much left for the gearbox. They just bought an off-the-shelf solution. With the Coupe, most of the body panels are all new, despite it having a very familiar look both inside and outside. Perhaps most radical, apart from the Coupe styling, is the T-roof here with these removable glass panels. The tint on here is supposed to mean that you don't actually need any sunblinds for it, but yeah, they remove and you can create this sort of targa top design. It also had some specially developed Torsen power steering, which was designed and developed initially with that quite powerful and torquey 2-litre turbo engine in mind. It's got vented discs up front and regular discs at the back. Come 1994, there was a facelift for the Coupe, and it introduced the chrome grille that you see on this particular example we're driving today. That brought it in line with the hatchback, saloon, and by then the Sport Tourer model that had also been introduced. There's also a Cabriolet as well. So the R8 model had really expanded. What a range: 5-door hatch, 3-door hatch, saloon, estate, Cabriolet, and Coupe. It was clearly a car they were making the most of. Sadly, as part of that facelift in '94, there were a few cost reductions that were in play. Things like reduced use of wood and leather in certain places, and early cars had an illuminated ignition barrel in the steering column, and that was deleted as well. Little cost-saving measures like that never ring true really, particularly when you're dealing with a premium brand like Rover. Come 96, however, the R8 is then finally replaced by a new 200 hatchback, the more compact, curvaceous hatchback, and consequently the coupe lived on, but without the 200 name, and it just became known as the Rover Coupe. And actually there were bigger changes afoot by then. The interior is then reworked, so you've got this lovely curvaceous interior on this particular example, which is from the later 200 hatch. But sadly that also meant the end of the engine lineup from those early cars. So the 1.6 Honda D-Series engine was removed, and an all K-Series engine lineup was introduced. So the 2-litre T-Series engine was basically replaced by the 1.8 K-Series engine and the 1.8 variable valve model that was also seen in the MGF VVC model. And unfortunately that was never the flagship that the 2-litre 220 turbo was. It was much slower to 60, about 7.5 seconds as opposed to 6, and its top speed was something like 130 miles an hour instead of almost 150. But I really like the Rover Coupe. It was often overlooked in favour of other kind of similar style models at the time. The Vauxhall Calibra, of course, was probably the best known here in the UK, Opel Calibra to those of you elsewhere. And then you got things like the VW Corrado, the Ford Probe. Even BMW had a 3 Series coupe by then, the E36 shape, and there was the Honda Prelude and many others. And motoring journalists at the time seemed to much prefer those models as opposed to this. And I don't really know why. Maybe it was a clash of image. The sporty coupe pretensions didn't really sit well with perhaps the slightly more mature and upmarket Rover badge. I don't know. Personally, I always loved the look of it. I'm less of a fan of the chrome grille on the facelift models, but I do like the styling. I think it's distinctive. So in many ways, the car I've got here today should be the best of the bunch. This is the 216, so it's got a K-Series engine in it, mated to the 5-speed manual box. It's all the car you could ever want. It's riding on what by today's standards is quite minuscule 15-inch alloys, but arguably with roughly around 110 horsepower, it's probably ample amounts of power for a car of this competence, if you like, in terms of chassis and dynamics. The steering is light. It doesn't feel particularly direct or full of feel, but it's fine. It's not so vague to make it unpleasant, or you find yourself sort of constantly twirling the wheel. The gear change is pleasant. The clutch is nicely weighted. The brakes are fine. The ride is actually not too bad at all. It's actually quite supple over these slightly sort of undulating and bumpy minor roads. It's coping quite well. Quite like these heavily bolstered seats, although you do sit quite high up, it's fair to say. If you think about it, the Rover Coupe had a really short shelf life. It was on sale for just 6 years. And in a way, despite those early flourishes and all that potential and promise of the R8 platform and everything that Rover did with it, this particular period is a troubled one. BMW obviously took over the company in '94, but had quickly run out of patience with it by the turn of the millennium. So you could start to see the kind of beginnings of the end, if you like. And although the Rover 75 made it out into the world by 1998, I think by then BMW, the then owners, had seen the writing on the wall. And cars like the Rover Coupe just sort of faded into the background somewhat. It lacks all of that ingenuity, that flair, that boldness, that charm, the idiosyncrasy and yet blatant brilliance of early Rovers like the P6 or the SD1. But it's competent, it's capable. It managed to sort of galvanise the very best bits of Honda, but throw a bit of Rover at it for good measure. So actually the end product is probably better than it deserves to be on paper. Like a lot of these sort of hatchback derived coupes, it's all very familiar underpinnings. If it is just effectively an R8 underneath, all the sort of serviceable parts are very familiar fare, and that K-Series engine is very well supported. It's actually quite good on fuel. It's a decently reliable engine as long as you keep it maintained. When I spoke to our colleagues at Peter Best Insurance, you can even insure one of these for not much more than a couple of £100 a year. So as a kind of modern classic, I suppose you could call it, it's a really sensible proposition, something a bit out of the ordinary. I think ultimately it just gets overlooked because it perhaps didn't have that curvaceous, simplistic beauty of the Calibra, perhaps the brash razzmatazz of a Ford Probe, maybe that Teutonic solidity of a BMW E36 Coupe, or indeed that high-tech oriental charm of a Honda Prelude. But it's not that bad either. When Autocar and Motor compared this with the Vauxhall Calibra, the Rover came second, but the testers sort of said the Calibra only won because it was the least worse of the two. It seemed to damn both of them with faint praise, I suppose. They could never really put their finger on anything that was so overwhelmingly bad about the car, but they couldn't bring themselves to say what was overwhelmingly good about it either. And I think that was probably true of a lot of British cars that came out around that time. They just weren't class leading. It didn't mean they were bad, they just weren't doing enough to push the boundaries. And fast forward 30 years and these cars arguably do show their age. And while it's hardly going to be known as Rover's peak, it's still a lovely thing, and we should appreciate the coupe for what it was. I like it. Right, thank you very much. What the hell's this? These gadgets.